connections to the eastern states. Okay, next slide, please. Another source, which I'm going to mention, and I'm not sure if Lee would cringe or not when I do, is energy from crop residues. But I'm not talking about native forest residues. I'm talking about the residues from some of our agricultural crops like sugarcane, but also plantation forest residues. And we could probably provide 20% of our electricity by about 2030 from this source. We have, even during drought conditions, we have quite a large amount of residue. And that would make an important component of a renewable energy mix for our grid. It's base load power, 24 hours a day power. The picture, as I mentioned before, is burning mainly sugarcane residues at Rocky Point in Queensland. It's one of the few power stations burning residues from so-called biomass, organic materials. Next slide. Now we come to a very exciting technology. It's not entirely new. The picture on the right shows an old concentrated solar thermal power station in California, which has been running for over 20 years. But the interesting feature of this station is that you can put low-cost storage into this system. The one you can see, it concentrates sunlight, and this one concentrates it along a line in which there's fluid, oil travelling through a pipe. The oil gets heated, it exchanges its heat to produce steam, to turn a turbine and generate electricity. What's happened recently, starting from about 2004, is that a new generation of concentrated solar thermal power stations is being built. Sadly, not yet really in Australia, but in Spain and in some states of the United States, in North Africa and the Middle East. And these stations are going to be much cheaper. They can be rolled out. They're really at a stage where they are semi-commercial already, so they could be rolled out very rapidly given the right government policies. And in Spain, they can store the energy cheaply overnight, not as electricity, but as heat. So some of the heat in the daytime is used, of course, to generate electricity, and part of the heat is carried into a store and stored in Spain in molten salt tanks, which is very cheap. It's common salts. And then these stations can run through the night, taking the heat out of these storage tanks. So they give the lie to the claims that some politicians have made, effectively, that the sun doesn't shine at night. With this technology, the sun can shine at night, 24 hours a day. Of course, you need enough land area, and Australia is blessed with a lot of marginal land that really now isn't much good for much else, and you only need quite a small amount. A square 50 kilometres by 50 kilometres could generate all of Australia's electricity from this source. Of course, you wouldn't do it from one source. You would have a mix of sources for stability of the system. But this technology is very exciting. There are no policies in Australia at present to roll out this technology on a large scale. At best, we have something called the Solar Flagships program, which is going to produce, if we're lucky, a couple of demonstration plants by about 2015. And that's assuming, well, again, that's beyond a lot of the political horizons. Next, please. So here's a picture on two of these stations in Spain. The left-hand side is the same type, only a modern version of the kind you saw previously. They're called parabolic troughs. On the right-hand side, you've got a lot of mirrors focusing sunlight on that central tower, heating that up. It's a different type of system. Both systems work extremely well, and these are some of the technologies that could be running Australia in the future. So at the University of New South Wales, we're working on scenarios for Australia's energy future. And what you see here is a transition away from coal by 2030. So we're starting here at 2010, going to 2030. This green bar at the bottom is hydro. It's not going to increase significantly in this dry country. Coal is here, and you can see it going down. Gas initially grows to help take up the slack, And then towards 2030, gas is starting to decline because we're starting to run into very high-priced gas shortages, because gas will also be substituting for oil, and we have reached essentially the peak in global oil production. Australia's oil production peaked back in year 2000. Wind power, the yellow one, growing rapidly. Bioenergy, that's from plantation forests and crop residues, growing rapidly. And starting from a smaller base, the solar technologies. I forgot to mention photovoltaics, which you've all seen, that also has a role to play, as well as concentrated solar thermal power. And then if all goes to plan, probably starting significantly during the 2020s, we'll start to see significant growth in what we call hot rock geothermal power, about which a question was asked before. And the reason that this is going to play a smaller role initially is that it is still at an early stage of development. In Australia, it hasn't actually been demonstrated on any significant scale. In Europe and in the state of Nevada, in the US, there are small-scale demonstrations working, so the technology works, but it still needs a lot of further development. And then also, further down the track, we'll start to see increasing contributions from marine sources of energy, like wave power and tidal current power and so on. But they are still at a demonstration stage around the world. So basically it is now quite feasible to imagine that within about 20-25 years, we could have phased out all fossil fuels within Australia. And this is a country that is highly dependent on fossil fuels. 77% of our electricity comes from coal, and most of the rest from gas, with about 6 or 7% from hydro, and about 1% from the other renewables right now. And just to answer the question that was asked before, currently of the coal that is mined each year in Australia, we burn 20% of it in Australia and we export 80%. Now the thing I forgot to mention is this box on the right. Energy efficiency is what's stopping this endless growth in demand, which would, if we allowed it to, we'd go right off the top of the slide there. So energy efficiency has a vital role, but it's a sort of temporary role, because although it has a huge potential contribution and a lot of cost savings that it can give, you can't keep increasing energy efficiency forever and ever. So you do have to come to grips with the other drivers of the growth in demand, which is the growth in consumption per person and the growth in population. Next slide. Okay, now let's talk about policy, because the election is coming, and I'm going to argue that in fact no single policy is going to make this transition, to drive this transition. We need a mix of different policies, and included in that mix is a pricing mechanism like a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme that works, or a renewable energy target, or a feed-in tariff, or better, a combination of all of those. We also need some direct government expenditure for research, development and demonstration, for building infrastructure like railways and new transmission lines. We certainly need regulations and standards to promote energy efficiency, particularly in buildings, because we have a situation there of complete market failure. There are enormous cost savings that can be made, but the market isn't driving the change, and that's because you have all sorts of things, like if you live in rented accommodation, it's not in your interest as a tenant to make your building more energy efficient, because that would benefit the landlord, and it's not in the landlord's interest to make it more energy efficient, because he or she doesn't pay the energy costs.